Welcome to MindBridge Edge 2023. This session is navigating the AI regulatory landscape, what it means for you. We're going to be covering how the AI regulations that may be coming or are here and how they interplay with the accounting and audit regulations. A quick disclaimer before we get started. I do represent MindBridge here today, but please blame me for all of my own personal opinions. I'm also not here on behalf of any of the different various third-party organizations that I may represent. I am Danielle Sutkus-Cheek, the VP of Strategy and Industry Relations here at MindBridge. I sit on a number of various different roles, including I'm on the ASB, I'm on the Technology Experts Group of IESVA, and on a similar task force for PEAK, which is the UF Ethics Group. So why are we here is what I want to start with, then get into the AI regulations, and then the impact to our accounting and audit standards and regulations. Please feel free to ask questions as we go, and I'll do my best to answer those as we go or throughout at the end. So there's a wave coming in transparency in capital markets. I think the digitalization of the finance function means that there's a concept that is hard to define on what is knowable now. When you think about the amount of data that exists and that with hindsight and retrospective, I could go find anything that I'm specifically looking for if I know it to be there. So then trying to figure out what is knowable now as you do not have the benefit of hindsight is really complicated. The reason that you're seeing so much AI is because AI helps you curate that information. However, as you just heard in our last session with Ari Goldfarb, there's a lot of different complexities in releasing different concepts of AI. And the decoupling of human prediction and human judgment really does impact this industry. So a little bit briefly about AI regulation. I'm not going to go through and cover every single jurisdiction's regulation. The great resource for that is the Holistic AI's Polaris Guide. That is in beta right now. I was able to get you a screenshot in advance. They have an interactive map of all the different jurisdictions around the world, and then by state within the United States, because it is a decentralized structure of regulation, what is coming and the different, like even court filings of what to watch for. This is going to be profoundly important to watch out what AI regulation comes in different jurisdictions, not only for what you do as your own internal organization, but to the extent that you are assessing somebody else's organization, such as an auditor, knowing the regulatory landscape is going to be relevant. Now, the big kahuna is obviously the EU AI Act. My personal opinion is this is going to be the next GDPR. And we all probably remember how much work it took to comply with GDPR, and it became a worldwide standard, even though there's only effective related to EU citizens. The EU AI Act is going to have 4 different categories of risk related to AI. There's going to be concepts such as unacceptable risk. This is the stuff about taking over the human experience. That's all the scary robot uprising stuff, a lot of the profiling type, really scary uses of AI. Those are going to be prohibited as unacceptable risk. Then high risk are going to be things that can heavily impact the human experience, and they're going to be regulated and require a certain additional amount of transparency and third-party assessment. Limited risk will require just transparency, and that can be difficult for a lot of organizations to comply. If you want to know about how to kind of have the transparency within MindBridge, please check out my next session directly following this one. We will talk about that piece. And then lower minimal risk, those are going to have no obligations. You know, that's probably going to be where some of your like generative art concepts, we don't really impact the human experience as much. As important as art is to the human experience, if I can't create generative AI art, it doesn't mean I can't get access to a banking loan or something like that, or get access to housing. So that will be a lower minimal risk that you don't necessarily always need transparency. This is something to watch. It's not effective yet, but something really big to watch. And this also does come on the heels of GDPR. So not only do I think it's going to be the next GDPR, but in GDPR, there is a clause in there that says that you have the right to an explanation of a decision. So in some cases, there's already a lot of transparency that needs to happen within the world of AI. So what does that mean for auditing regulations and accounting regulations? I think that's where we really, as accountants And finance professionals, that's kind of what does all that mean? Do all that stuff mean for us? So in the world of general professional accountants ethics, some of y'all may or may not know that IASBA did release an update to their ethical framework for the use of technology. It's gone through all the exposure drafts and it's finalized in its issuance, but it's not effective yet. It's effective December 15th, 2024. So we do have a little bit of time to actually put effectiveness in it. The intent was not to fundamentally change anything, but make the standards or the framework to be more scalable for future technology. The overall approach that IASBA took is a concept of equating technology like the use of an expert. And so the concepts of what you would have to do to supervise the use of an expert on something are similar to how they expect you to supervise the use of a technology. Another important feature is that they a lot of times talk about relying upon the output of that technology. So that gives you a lot of different options on how you supervise the technology when you're going to the point of a reliance on the output. There's a fundamental change in some of their earlier drafts. So I'm not going to read everything that's on my slides, but let me just read a couple pieces just to push this in full impact for y'all. A professional accountant who intends to use the output of a technology shall exercise the professional judgment to determine the steps appropriate to fulfill this responsibilities set out in the paragraph I'm about to show you. So that's great. That seems comfortable and that makes sense to us. However, if anybody can do my reading test at the bottom of the screen and see my little source, I put this from part 2, which is for those that are accountants in business or otherwise known as in industry. This ethical framework not only applies to those of you that are in public practice, but it also applies to those of you that are in private practice as well within an organization. Part 1 and part 2 look almost exactly the same. So I've used everything from part 2 just to make the point, but anybody that's a public accountant, it'll be similar wording. I'm not going to read this slide, obviously, for obvious reasons, but here's the paragraph that it just referenced of all the different things that you need to comply with. And this is the same as what was before. So these are the concept is you have to assess the use of your technology the same way you'd assess before, or the same end result requirement, but the how is what is changing, not necessarily the underlying responsibilities. Okay. Now, they also include a lot of threats related to the associated use of technology. A self-interest threat and self-review threats, obviously. One of the complexities in self-review threats is, again, this is from part 2, accountants in business. Most of us see self-review threats as being very concepts related to independence and related to those in public accounting. I realize that's not always the case, but that is where you're going to start to see, depending on what you build in-house or not, where do you have to assess different things. I think you're also going to have to spend more time assessing technology and determining what you can rely upon. And again, for how to do this, catch my next session on this topic. When they went through and provided a list of factors, these are not thou shalt only include these factors, but these are kind of a working list of what you can use. It does very much focus again on that output concept. That's important because of some situations where you do not have a glass box of the technology of how it works. There are different ways to still supervise the use of a technology, even if you're not in a situation like MindBridge is for glass box. So what is being performed by the technology, the expected use or reliance or output of the technology? Or do you have the ability to, or have access to an expert to understand and explain the technology? Has it been attested and evaluated for the purpose, your prior experience, the employing organization? So this is from the business side. Oversight of the design, development, implementation, the controls related to the use, and the appropriateness of the actual inputs that drive your output. All fairly straightforward. And if any of y'all are firms that have gone through different concepts related to ISQM, then all these are actually going to be pretty straightforward for y'all, because in order to assess the use of a vendor from a QM perspective, These are all fairly aligned and similar, so not that big of a lift. For those of y'all in industry or in business, this may not be something that y'all done. For firms, don't forget, if you're a member of Forum of Firms, that actually does obligate you to the concept of the international IASBA framework as well. And while the US doesn't have exactly this concept, none of these are in a concept that would be misaligned with the US's ethical frameworks. Also, with the US converging on SQMS to ISQM, so US has already put out standards that are very similar to ISQM, but they're not effective yet. Those vendor assessments will pretty much force you into this concept related to the use of technology for those of you that are in public accounting that are subject to EQM standards. Okay, so that's pretty heavy public. Let's talk also about the actual organizations themselves and accounting concepts as well. So when you have, oops, sorry, my voice broke there a little bit. When you have different regulations that are requirements for the different organizations to follow, let's go back to that EU AI Act right here. If I'm an organization that is subject to an audit, just say, for example, and I'm a limited risk organization, I have the requirement to have transparency. If I do not fulfill my requirement for transparency, then I have a theoretical fine risk and maybe other risks. If you heard our session with Holistic AI, where they did a little bit more deeper dive in the EU AI Act, the fines are substantial. Several percentage points of revenue are the maximum fines. That means if I do not comply with the standard, I then have a non-compliance with law and regulation. That also means if I have a fine that could come with it, I may have a contingent liability. If the fine has been assessed, but I haven't been recording it, I have an unrecorded liability in totality for that fine. I could even have litigation associated with more contingent liabilities. And so there's a really big push right now for auditors to determine non-compliance with laws and regulations because of those risks of unrecorded liabilities, particularly in the concept of contingent liabilities. The US has come out with several different exposures recently and final standards. So just watch these two to grab. Peak came out with one, as well as the ASB, the Auditing Standards Board, related to predecessor communications, related to fraud and NOCLAR. So different things to watch for. Also, you should watch the IAASB Fraud Project. That one is working on making sure that the expectations gap, which is the difference between what the public expects that an audit is versus what the auditor's defined responsibilities are, start to converge some. I think a lot of people have watched TV shows and expect an audit to be absolute assurance. And any of my auditors on the call today know we're only free from material misstatement and a concept of reasonable assurance, depending on the nature of the service you're providing. So this fraud project is going to have additional expectations for additional procedures. It does reference NOCLAR. They're not opening the full NOCLAR standards, but I would watch out for non-compliance with different frauds and regulations. Because of some of the different concepts of what is coming, I think the line has blurred on what is fraud and non-compliance on laws and regulations. So just one of the projects to watch. It hasn't been finalized yet. Now, those of you that are in the US or are required to follow any US PCAOB guidance, the PCAOB did put out a very substantial NOCLAR exposure draft. I personally have no idea if this will be the final version. It is a fairly cumbersome requirement on the auditors, and there are a lot of organizations that have said that it's a little beyond scope. It would require the auditor to identify and create an inventory of all the different laws and regulations, and then do a risk assessment against all those different laws and regulations, and then develop appropriate audit procedures. This will be very complex for if you are auditing the organization that has a heavy use of AI with all these different AI regulations that are coming, especially in the US, where there is a very disconnected framework, and each jurisdiction, each state is doing something very different. So if we go back to what to do to track, this guide, the Polaris guide from Holistic AI, is going to be very important to be able to track those kinds of things and what jurisdictions you have to pay attention to what. So with only a few minutes left, I know these sessions are pretty short, but hopefully you're getting a quick deep dive. I wanted to cover a little bit of what I've referred to on the ISQM and SQMS related to vendor assessments. Because technology is becoming so important to many organizations, you really do have to pay attention to your vendor assessments and the various different requirements. ISQM has a very specific list. It's paragraph A107. It's on your screen, but you can also download if you go to the detailed section of your screen below and find the actual standard as well with that source button. There's also several international guides and helpful resources. The session next, where we talk about how to explain the use of your AI to others, will also be valuable here. ICAEW also put out a decent guide as well, and that's in the links for this resource page. SQMS, which is the US equivalent, is very similar. It's not effective yet for those that are only in the US. So it will help for those that have already gone through ISQM to put out different resources. I think some of the larger firms are already presenting a lot of information here. But if you haven't started, I do recommend starting pretty soon. It is pretty complex. Again, watching my next session will provide you a lot of assistance. One of the ones that I've liked a lot is the crosswalk document from Squash 8, SQCS, excuse me, to SQMS. I'm struggling with my acronyms here. And that crosswalk document will help you quite a bit to be able to get you through those different things. So again, if you think back to what these objectives are, so the related quality objective and quality risk, the nature and the scope of the resource, the extent to which the resource is being used across the firm, and how it's being used in the firm, and whether it's suited for purpose, the extent of customization that you've created or your previous use of that vendor. And we go back to the ethical framework for relying upon technology in the ISBA exposure draft. It's actually very similar. These are surprisingly similar. It's going to be helpful for anybody that has already gone through their ISQM to go back and use a lot of those resources in order to comply with the ISBA standard. I also think that even if you are not subject to ISBA, that it is worth taking a look at these because they're really a best practice. It's not anything that you would see as unadvisable. And I think as you go through this exercise to be able to make sure you can rely upon your own technology, it'll also help strengthen your ability to assess your client's use of technology if you are in a situation where you're going to have to spend more time assessing the non-compliance with laws and regulations of your auditee clients, because it is going to be pretty complex to go through this requirement. Now, again, I want to make sure that everyone realizes that this standard is not a live standard yet. Okay, so I think we have time, just under 5 minutes for Q&A. So let's see if we have any questions that have come in the chat. Okay, here we go. Is the lack of transparency going to be an actual violation of a law or regulation? So really good question. I think, let's go back to that EU AI Act thing. Really, if you have a requirement for transparency in the EU AI Act, then yes, it could be a non-compliance with law or regulation. If you're not in a position where you have this kind of requirement, then it may not be. So that's probably going to just depend on what the EU does on AI. From what I also understand, that the EU AI Act is actually also like really broad in its definition of AI. And so some things that are not traditionally considered AI may actually fall under the definition of AI. Okay, next question. What happens if I rely upon something that I didn't know have AI that I didn't know had AI in it, and my work, and then someone relies on me, but I didn't even know I used AI? Will I have a problem? Oh, that, because it's a concept of output, you could probably get into a situation where you might be okay if you have vetted enough on the actual output itself. That might be okay. However, if there's a heavy amount of work that's being done that you do not have an understanding of what has happened to get to that output, if you go back and look at these list of factors, there is a concept of being able to understand the inputs and the process in this last one, the appropriateness of the inputs to the technology, and the related decisions being made. You could run into a problem that if you don't know that there's AI behind the scenes, that you don't have a good assessment there. However, if you get to the point where you have a really solid work that has been done on the output, even if there's been some use of AI to get to that output, my guess is it's something like, my guess is the question something about ChatGPT, because aren't we all talking about it today? So if somebody gives you a work paper result that's been used with ChatGPT, and you didn't know that ChatGPT was used, but yet you do all the work to make sure that that output is reliable, then you probably don't have a massive risk. But can you do enough on the output to not know is really the question that would have to be assessed within each organization for what it means to you. We probably have time for one more. Okay, what do you think about all of the ChatGPT lawsuits? So there's two sets of lawsuits that I'm aware of. The first one was a lawyer inappropriately did not assess the use of his work that it came out of ChatGPT, and then had a let's call it a big kerfuffle publicly, where he did not properly have real citations, and he got in a lot of trouble. However, I don't know if that one's the case, but there are a series of class action lawsuits related to the concept of who owns what IP, and that ChatGPT may not have had the rights to use whatever IP is underlying the large language model that's creating it. I think it's going to be really interesting on what happens. I haven't seen the results of those. I'm actually very intrigued to see what happens, and that's going to be something to really watch. I'm curious is my thought process on that one. Let me see if there's any more. Okay, I think that's it, and we have only about 30 seconds left in time. So thank you so much for joining us. I hope you'll join me for my next session that will go into a little bit more of the tactics on how to actually properly explain this to a particular regulator, now that we know we have a fair amount of AI regulation, as well as accounting and audit regulation that is going to be impacted by the coming AI regulation. I will see you in a moment.